Okay, building off of Brian De Palma's The Fury, I did a presentation yesterday on this, and I think I just got so swept up in what was going on with all the informational parts and the magnetic resonance aspect of the research that I kind of missed discussing the test between Amy Irving and the Paragon Institute that kind of opens early in the film. So basically, part of the Fury is that I think that people really need to sort of focus on is it was made in 1972, right? So they were being a little bit more open in Hollywood about this research being done. They talked about these types of site research facilities going out and trying to find people that had these abilities. They didn't mind talking about it out in the open as much. So kind of have to ask yourself what happened there. And in the movie, they even kind of discuss it that there's kind of this creepy guy that seems to go out looking for, like a finder, similar to what the Finders cult did. They go out looking for these people and they kind of stalk them and look for them, and then they report back to one of these like central agencies that looks for these types of people to exploit their abilities. And so that's kind of the path that the story takes in the movie. But I didn't want to talk as much about that part without discussing the science of it and why these people are so interested in this as an ability. So what is actually happening in the test that's going on between Amy Irving and Carrie Snodgress in the movie? Well, the technology is currently available. You can buy it sometimes for less than $100 to do some basic testing, and it's called EEG, electroencephalograph type equipment. It's usually marketed as a gimmick or a toy. Mattel sells it, for example. They have different types of things that they do with it, just to control, like remote control helicopters or like a rolling ball on the floor type thing with your thought forms. And but there is a science that can be explored further with it that involves, things involving bioplasma, chi, orgone, the positive orgone radiation, deadly orgone radiation, etheric energy, that type of things that involve, the category of bioplasma and bioenergetics. I think it's been kind of distracted though because they want people to think of it more as a toy and less as something serious, and that'll keep it the serious research limited to a select group. But I really do think that since there's some basic tools available that seem to be relatively inexpensive, that we should at least be looking into these things in a more, focused level, even if we don't have access to some serious equipment, like, the ones you see in one of these diagrams I have here. There's like the medical grade equipment, but you can also get these cheaper headsets that, function sort of like a toy, but still take real measurements. But how does that work, right? Well, getting back to it, Amy Irving, she places this headset on. They ask her to imagine a blank movie screen and to block out all outside stimuli as much as possible, to only focus on the movie screen. Like you could practice it now if you wanted to. You just basically just kind of like, you don't close your eyes, you just kind of like stare straight forward and you just kind of block everything out. And as you're doing this and you fall deeper into this, I don't know, it's not necessarily a hypnotic state, but as you go deeper into this alpha state, you can actually feel the energy kind of just start to go, kind of pulls down a little bit. I've done this, I've practiced this many times myself. I know I'm capable of reaching alpha pretty easily, just through meditation and practice. So I just never had an opportunity to actually measure it on my own. So that's the type of thing that I'm interested in doing now. I just don't have the funding, even just to buy the basic equipment. So I'll get there though, not a problem. But anyways, the point is that by doing this, as she's going into alpha, her brain is emitting a low volt signal, right? And then that translates to a very specific measurement. So you got to think of it in terms of both frequency and amplitude. Okay, so there's an amplitude to the frequency that she's generating by having that headset on her forehead there, and so that disc, that cup that's on her forehead, it's actually measuring the frequency, so that waveform, what it looks like. So as she's going into alpha state, how do the bursts, how do the waveforms get measured? And then it's actually measuring the amplitude. So how much like electrical signal is she generating when she goes into alpha state? See, and this is where I think that they kind of hide some of the research as far as different blood groups and different types of people and what they mean to psychic intuition, psi ability. I think what you'll probably find if you start doing more research is that people that are like Rh negative and similar types of blood groups, like people that are like universal donor blood types, like O negative, I think, or those types of things, you'll find that there's something involving the iron content and iron oxides inside the hemoglobin processing inside their blood that I think has something to do with what makes them unique. And it's not just that they can do those things. I think oftentimes the reason why they're more intuitive or have psi ability is just because of that metal content. It's really not like it should be considered anything sort of esoteric in the classic sense. It's really just chemistry and alchemy in a way. It's really just that a person, just like an antenna and a cell tower, you have copper as a kind of a conductor inside the coaxial cable. People, when they have different metals inside their bloodstream, can probably just be stronger conductors just by virtue of that content. And then when you consider that there's coils inside there, and then through the modern processing of foods and things like that, we have more shaved metals and things and metal particulates being introduced into our foodstuffs. Whether it's intentional or unintentional, it just happens. So there's just more of these things that are introducing metals into our bloodstream and into our environment. And then if you think about it, that sort of creates like an amplified grid to the people that have certain bloodlines. It's a hypothesis, but it's a measurable one. So as long as there's cheap equipment out there, I think that there's ways that we can integrate this into researching things that involve orgone, and then how the brain reaches different states and what type of electrical signals can be generated, because there really are actual concepts involved with this. Um, okay. So let me just read this because I typed something out ahead of time. I try not to do that if I can help it, but I put brainwaves are generally categorized as each one typically representing expected behavioral states, and in some people, varying degrees of amplitude as well as frequency changes. So, I just talked about this, but what that means to say is that not only they're measuring that waveform as you see it like on the graph there, but they can actually tell you by virtue of like millivolts or microvolts, depending on what type of equipment's being used, the actual level of the amplitude. And so that amplitude, the higher it is, the faster it moves the train. And that's really what's going on inside that diagram. So the deeper she reads alpha states, the more millivolts are generated, and the millivolts that are generated from that headset through her alpha state goes into the train tracks, and then that powers the train and moves around. And that's really all it is. And so once you understand that that's a real thing, and that they were even testing it like that in 1972 out in the open, even though it was a fictional Paragon Institute, it must tell you something about what they know today. Because the research that I've been doing seems to indicate that whoever was doing this research, groups like SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation, and SRI, SAIC had sole ownership over this site research, and they were doing quite a bit of it. And I can read you some of their things, but I'll get to that in a second. I first want to just cover what is happening. Not only is she getting an amplitude of electricity inside that signal, but she's also generating a frequency, right? And that's where you start getting into what is an alpha wave, what is a beta wave, what is a gamma wave. So it just depends on the group that's doing the measurement, but they define, like an alpha wave will be 8 to 13 hertz, which can be defined as, 1 cycle per second, so is a hertz, okay? So if you have 8 hertz, then effectively you have 8 of those, complete cycles of a waveform going up, and one continuous wave like that goes up and down. That's a cycle, and then that's 8 of those within 1 second. Just think of it in terms of that, right? So if you're an alpha, you're between 8 to 13 of those cycles per second, 8 to 13 hertz. Beta, you're 16 to 31 hertz. Gamma, you're 32 to 100 hertz, etc. Okay, without getting too deep into that. So the reason why that's relevant is because as I've been doing more research, I've gone onto the CIA.gov's FOIA library. There's an enormous amount of documentation that got put out. I think it was about a year and a half, 2 years ago. There was just a flood of documents that had been previously only available if you actually physically went to the library, that somebody went there and actually scanned in everything and placed it on the official library. So this isn't something that's abstract. These are all documents that I've pulled directly from our own government's website and the Freedom of Information Act website. And getting to that, Science Applications International Corporation was studying this exact concept that you see with Amy Irving in the Paragon Institute. And they even had their program called Pearl, P-E-A-R, Paragon, Pearl, Anyways, you can kind of see the correlation. He may have been referencing that exact program. But I just wanted to read this quote from you, and I'll put it up here on the screen because this is from one of their actual documents. It says, "It is an established neurological fact that a brain generates alpha waves at approximately 10 hertz, and that these waves diminish significantly whenever the brain's idle state is interrupted by an external stimuli. EEG experiments conducted by SAIC seems to have demonstrated for the first time in anomalous cognition research that reception of an AC signal by the brain does in fact interrupt the alpha rhythm in the same manner as would any other external signal. This is called event-related desynchronization." I got to tell you, when I read that, it makes me kind of think that that's a clever way of saying electroshock therapy or like a lobotomy. Like you're actually disrupting a person's, they call it anomalous cognition as AC, but whenever I read through their documentation, I tend to notice that they will mix terms. So a lot of times AC also equals alternating current, which means a shock. So I'll let you determine whether or not you believe that's true or not. It's just another interpretation that's possible, judging from what I know about that organization. So anyways, continuing on. The potential value added of this experimental result is the potential use of ERD to improve to improve anomalous cognition functioning, analogous to the method in which biofeedback can be used to train a person to alter his physiological responses. So, getting back to that, they're basically telling you that you're measuring this brain wave at this certain amount of hertz, and that if you interrupt that signal with a certain amount of hertz, that you can throw them off their thought pattern, which is called event-related desynchronization. So you actually do something, it's almost like saying boo, for lack of a better term. That's effectively what event-related desynchronization is. It's a way of either introducing a shock in the sense of a behavioral shock or an actual literal electrical shock. In either case, they both generate electricity, you understand? So if even a person's like shocked, whether they're frightened, if come out of nowhere and say boo, that generates a spike in electricity, you see? So it's all sort of true at the same time, you understand? You'll actually have a millivolt or type signal that's generated from that if you were to measure it with an EEG headset on. So again, these are the kind of things that I'm interested in studying, having somebody watch like a scary movie or having somebody surprise them while they're wearing an EEG headset. What type of energy is generated from POR and DOR spectrum, what kind of electrical signals are generated when you feel incredibly happy, when you feel ecstatic, when you feel in love, when you feel in lust, whatever those things are. These are all relevant because these are all things that generate electrical signals and alpha waves, beta waves, gamma waves, all these things. And since we know that that's transferable to actual electricity, it's worth discussing because there is such a thing as what's called human piezoelectric energy harvesting that I don't think very many people are aware of, because typically when that term is used, you don't see the word human in there. It's just simply called piezoelectric energy harvesting, which is simply the concept of using vibration, and then like a combination of vibrating signals and kinetic energy and things like that to generate electricity. So, there's something to that in regards to what's being done with some of these experiments and what might be done in controlled environments sometimes to extract energy from people without them even being aware of it. So I thought that's worth noting because it almost seems like this research was kind of out in the open there about 30, 40 years ago. They didn't seem mind talking about it. Then it just sort of just disappeared, and now you only find it in science fiction news shows. At a higher level when it's being discussed there, you'll see it in shows like Fringe or something like that, where it's it's being kept in like the context of science fiction, and then what's available to us, they present it as a toy. It's something that your kid can control this ball or an airplane with or something like that. You see, so it's like these two dynamics sort of make it to where it's not really being taken seriously. So that's all I'm trying to do is like whatever these technologies are, I just like an opportunity to explore this further. Anyways, getting back to that, they also talk about how these anomalous cognition is used in remote observation. So it continues on to say that this experiment demonstrated that changes in the electrical properties of one person's skin could be affected according to the intent of an isolated operator. It indicates that anomalous mental phenomenon can be used to remotely influence biological systems. So again, that gets back to archaeometry. That's remote sensing, but in this case, it's actual remote influence. So that's sort of like a combination of archaeometry, which involves remote viewing, remote sensing of information, but also the manipulation of those data sets potentially, whether it's conscious or unconscious, which would involve some form of psychometry, right? Because remember how when Amy Irving is running that alpha state test, when she reaches a certain level of amplitude in her signal, she's officially reached what's level 6, and that's known as psychometry. So think of that in terms of a parallel to archaeometry informationally. So I guess the thing that I'm a little bit fascinated by right now is I'm wondering is if I'm if there's something about my particular profile of DNA where I integrate with data in a term, in a way that sort of like integrates archaeometry with psychometry. And so again, I'm just trying to find some ways to do some of these tests for good reasons. I just like to find out a little bit more about some of the strange things that I've experienced because I know they're real just from my own experience. I mean, I have a lot of informational things that I synchronize with that feels very intuitive and psychic in nature, but see, I'm just not inclined to believe in things that are quote unquote paranormal. I'm interested in them, but I don't just believe them. I like to have it be a provable science. You know what I'm saying? So I just like to just get deeper into that with the research is all. So anyways, on a final thought here, there is when I was trying to do some research on this, I found on Wikipedia, and I don't know if this is true because I can't find too many other articles on it, but it said that there was on EEGs, which is the electroencephalograph, the test that they use to do that measurement that Amy Irving's in. That's a basic form of it. Um, it said that there's been a topic of discussion involving that they had a gelatin in the same room as an EEG and that it disrupted the EEG. And I thought about that a little bit, like what might make that possible. So I kind of looked up, well, what is gelatin? Because I never thought about it. And then I realized that the process of gelatin and jello, what makes gelatin is that they basically just take like fat and bone from all these animals and everything like that, and they just boil it down and condense it into this pattern, and that when it's placed back together, it gels back into this, gel, right? And that's what you eat is jello. So again, I never think about these things when we eat them, right? But that's what it is. And I thought about that. That's sort of when you really get down to it, it's almost like condensed life. As bioplasma, it's boiled down into a paste and everything like that, then consumed. It really does sort of have like an energy signature to it. You have to think that it could potentially have an energy signature to it, because the same way that the human brain will pass information on from one to the other, involving our water frequency, our what our brain waves are, what our amplitude is. You got to think about all these dynamics because they all fit into technology. The same way that you have a radio and a cell phone, and it's capable of transmitting a certain amplitude of signal at a certain waveform. Well, our brain is like that too, and the way we communicate between one another, the way we communicate as groups, the way we influence one another, the way we influence groups, all comes back to this technology. It all comes back to human processes, and these human processes are being, effectively, the technology is mimicking our human processes. See, we already function like radios. We already have an amplifier. We already have a waveform. And all a cell phone is doing is it's integrating an amplifier, a waveform, path-to-path communication. You see, these are all things that existed in the human condition prior to the technology existing. It's just something to think about. But in the process of that, I think that it would be very valuable for us to understand better, the energy signatures, what types of amplitude and signal levels that people of varying types of moods and aura fields, what type of energy they emit. Because I'd be curious if a person, when they are placed under Kirlian photography or have their aura measured, how does that transfer over to amplitude inside their alpha waves or their beta waves and that kind of thing, you see. So I think this is all worth exploring, and I think that there's a lot of good things that can come from this, really, when you think about it. Taking about everything we've talked about up until now, integrating some of the ideas of pyramidal energy, integrating some of the ideas of positive orgone spectrum. I mean, you could really do a lot of positive things for people if we really start to have a better understanding of this. I really think there's a lot of potential here. So anyways, thanks again to Brian De Palma. I really intended to get further into this, as far as like the Fury goes and everything like that when I was talking about him, but I just got swept up in the other things. So anyways, thanks again for listening, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.